The static crackles. A dim light flickers across the screen, revealing the sterile interior of a modern lab. The camera pans across sophisticated equipment, focusing finally on a weathered photograph lying on an illuminated table. Some photographs capture more than just moments. Some capture secrets. This photograph was taken in the summer of 1909 in the small town of Blackwood, Massachusetts. The Harrison family, respected, affluent, by all accounts, ordinary. James Harrison, a prominent banker. His wife Eleanor, their 3 children, William, age 12, Catherine, age 10, and little Thomas, just 6 years old. A perfect American family at the dawn of the 20th century. But photographs from this era hide their secrets well. The chemical processes, the silver halide emulsions, the long exposures, they captured more than the human eye could see. The dawn of the 20th century marked a period of unprecedented change and optimism in America. The Industrial Revolution had transformed society, bringing new inventions into everyday life at an astonishing rate. In 1909, the year the Harrison photograph was taken, the Wright brothers were demonstrating their flying machines to amazed crowds. Marconi's wireless telegraph was shrinking the vast distances between continents. Edison's phonograph was bringing recorded music into middle-class parlors. These technological marvels seemed to promise a future of endless possibility and progress. Photography itself was undergoing a revolution. The introduction of Eastman Kodak's Brownie camera in 1900 had begun to democratize what had previously been an expensive and technically demanding process. "You press the button, we do the rest," was Kodak's famous slogan, inviting ordinary people to create their own photographic memories without mastering the complex chemistry and optics that the process had previously required. Yet professional portrait photography, like that practiced by Edward Chambers, remained a specialized field requiring considerable expertise. The large format cameras used by studio photographers produced images of remarkable clarity and detail, capturing likenesses with a precision that still impresses us today. These cameras used glass plate negatives coated with light-sensitive emulsions, each plate individually prepared and developed through a series of chemical processes that demanded both scientific knowledge and artistic judgment. Family portraits like the one we're examining were significant events. They required planning, preparation, and considerable expense. The Harrisons would have dressed in their finest clothes, traveled to the photographer's studio, and sat perfectly still as the image was captured for posterity. Look at their expressions. Solemn, dignified, as was the custom. Notice the quality of the image itself, the clarity, the composition. This was the work of a skilled photographer, someone who understood both the technical and artistic aspects of his craft. When Dr. Eliza Morgan, a photographic conservator at the Smithsonian, began her routine preservation work on this image in January of this year, she had no reason to suspect anything unusual. The photograph had been donated as part of a collection of early 20th century American family portraits. But Dr. Morgan's work is thorough. She subjects each photograph to multiple forms of analysis, including infrared. Dr. Morgan has spent the last 15 years preserving America's photographic heritage. Her laboratory is equipped with the latest technology, allowing her to examine photographs at a molecular level, to stabilize deteriorating images, and to uncover details that time has obscured. The Harrison family portrait was just one of dozens in a collection she was processing, until it revealed something extraordinary. What she discovered defies explanation. When viewed under infrared light, there appeared to be another figure in the photograph, not visible to the naked eye. Not visible under ultraviolet or any other spectrum. Only infrared revealed its presence. A skeleton, standing behind the family, its bony hand resting on the shoulder of young Thomas. Not a vague outline or an indistinct shape that might be dismissed as a chemical aberration or a quirk of the developing process. A complete human skeleton, anatomically correct in every detail, positioned with deliberate precision behind the family, as if it had been there all along, invisible to everyone except the camera's unblinking eye. Tonight, we take you on a journey to uncover the truth behind this chilling discovery. Who was this spectral figure? What connection did it have to the Harrison family? And why did it only appear when death itself became visible to our technology? I'm Richard Blackwood, and you're watching Shadow Frames. At first, I thought it was contamination of the photographic plate. These old photographs, they're sensitive. They can develop anomalies over time. But this was different. The skeletal figure had perfect anatomical precision. The proportions were correct. The positioning relative to the family was consistent with a person standing there. It wasn't random. I've seen many strange anomalies in historical photographs. Dust particles that create orbs of light, chemical stains that resemble faces or figures, double exposures that create ghostly overlays. This was none of those things. The skeleton was detailed. Every vertebra, every rib, every delicate bone of the hand, rendered with medical accuracy. And there was something else. The skeleton wasn't simply superimposed on the image. It was interacting with it. Its hand, the phalanges, the carpals, they were positioned exactly on young Thomas Harrison's shoulder, as if it was touching him. I remember the moment I first saw it clearly under the infrared filter. My assistant had stepped out for lunch, and I was alone in the lab. The image appeared on my monitor, and I felt the room grow cold. I'm a scientist, trained to observe dispassionately, but there was something about the deliberate placement of that skeletal hand that sent a chill through me. It wasn't just present in the photograph, it seemed to have purpose. To understand this mystery, we must first understand the family at its center. The Harrisons were not just any family in Blackwood. They represented the promise of American prosperity at the turn of the century. James Harrison had established Blackwood Savings and Loan in 1897 during a period of economic growth. His father had been a successful merchant, and James had used his inheritance to establish himself in banking. By 1909, when this photograph was taken, he was one of the town's leading citizens. The story of James Harrison embodied the national narrative of self-made success that defined the Gilded Age and early Progressive era. Born to a modestly successful merchant family in 1870, he had worked his way through Harvard College, graduating in 1892 with a degree in economics and a network of connections that would serve him well in his banking career. His marriage to Eleanor Thornfield in 1895 united him with a family known for its intellectual accomplishments rather than its wealth, a choice that raised eyebrows among Boston's more traditional social circles, but reflected Harrison's forward-thinking mindset. The establishment of Blackwood Savings and Loan in 1897 marked Harrison's first major independent venture. He selected Blackwood deliberately, recognizing that the small but growing town offered opportunities that might not be available in more established financial markets. The bank initially occupied just 2 rooms above Blackwood's general store, but by 1905 had moved into an imposing granite building of its own design at the corner of Main Street and Elm, a physical manifestation of Harrison's rising status and success. Harrison's banking practices were considered progressive for the time. Unlike many small-town bankers who extended credit primarily to established businesses and landowners, Harrison developed special programs for first-time homebuyers, immigrant business owners, and even women seeking to establish their own enterprises, a radical concept in an era when married women still had limited property rights. These policies earned him both admirers and critics, but they unquestionably contributed to Blackwood's rapid development in the early 1900s. Beyond his business activities, Harrison invested heavily in Blackwood's cultural and educational infrastructure. His donation funded the town's first public library, opened in 1903 with an initial collection of 3,000 volumes and a special reading room for children, a feature Harrison insisted upon, believing that early exposure to books created lifelong readers. His support for the local public schools included scholarships for promising students and summer training programs for teachers at universities in Boston. In many ways, the Harrisons represented the progressive vision of what America could become: meritocratic, forward-looking, invested in education and community development. Their tragedy would later be interpreted by some as a judgment on this vision, a warning against abandoning traditional values and hierarchies. But in 1909, when they sat for their portrait with Edward Chambers, they were still emblematic of the optimistic spirit of their age, a young family whose future seemed as bright and promising as the new century itself. The Harrisons lived in this house on Maple Street, still standing today, though now divided into apartments. In 1909, it was one of the grandest homes in Blackwood, with 8 bedrooms, servant quarters, and extensive grounds. Constructed in 1898, the Harrison home was a showcase of modern amenities. Unlike most homes in Blackwood, it had indoor plumbing throughout, central heating via a coal furnace in the basement, and electric lighting in the main rooms. The parlor where the family received guests featured imported wallpaper and furniture ordered from Boston's finest establishments. A covered carriage house at the rear of the property was converted in 1908 to accommodate James Harrison's new Packard automobile, one of the first in town. The Harrisons were what you might call new money in Blackwood. James was ambitious, forward-thinking. He brought electricity to his home before most in town had it. They had one of the first telephones. Eleanor was active in the women's suffrage movement, which wasn't always popular in conservative circles. They were modern people for their time. Eleanor Harrison, in particular, stood out in Blackwood society. She had attended Vassar College, unusual for a woman of her generation, and brought progressive ideas back to this traditional New England community. She founded the Blackwood Ladies' Reading Society, which, despite its conventional name, became a forum for discussing women's rights and social reforms. Some of the town's older families found the Harrisons a bit too modern, a bit too eager to embrace change. But there was no denying their importance to the community. The children, too, were exceptional in their own ways. William, the eldest at 12 when the photograph was taken, was already showing academic promise. His teachers spoke of his facility with mathematics and science, unusual interests for a boy expected to follow his father into banking. Catherine, at 10, had inherited her mother's artistic sensibilities. She played the piano beautifully and had already won a regional competition for young musicians. And Thomas, the youngest at 6, was described as unusually perceptive for his age, thoughtful and observant, with an old soul's eyes in a child's face. But what of the photograph itself? Who took it, and under what circumstances? The photograph was taken by Edward Chambers, a professional photographer who had a studio on Blackwood's Main Street from 1898 until his death in 1924. Chambers was known for his technical skill and artistic composition, and his services were sought by the town's elite families. Edward Chambers belonged to a generation of photographers who had transformed their craft from a novelty into an art form. The pioneering work of figures like Matthew Brady, whose Civil War photographs had shown Americans the brutal reality of conflict, and Julia Margaret Cameron, whose atmospheric portraits had demonstrated photography's potential for emotional expression, had elevated photography beyond mere mechanical reproduction. By the early 1900s, photographers like Alfred Stieglitz were arguing forcefully for photography's recognition as a legitimate artistic medium, equal to painting or sculpture in its expressive possibilities. Chambers' training reflected this evolution. His apprenticeship with Francis Wellington at Philadelphia's premier portrait studio from 1891 to 1893 grounded him in the technical fundamentals of photography, the chemistry of developing solutions, the physics of light and lenses, the mechanics of camera operation. His subsequent work at Vandermeer Studios in New York from 1893 to 1898 exposed him to the artistic avant-garde, including the pictorialist movement that sought to create photographs with the emotional impact and aesthetic refinement of fine art paintings. These diverse influences were evident in Chambers' work. His technical precision, the clarity and detail of his images, reflected his scientific training and meticulous approach to the medium's mechanical aspects. But his compositional choices, his use of light and shadow, and his ability to capture something essential about his subjects revealed an artistic sensibility that transcended mere technical competence. The Harrison family portrait exemplified this combination, presenting its subjects with both documentary accuracy and subtle emotional resonance. What set Chambers apart from most of his contemporaries, however, was his continuing interest in photography's scientific applications. While many photographers of his generation were moving toward purely artistic expression, Chambers maintained his connection to photography's origins as a scientific tool. His correspondence with researchers at Harvard and MIT throughout the early 1900s showed his ongoing engagement with developments in spectroscopy, radiography, and other applications of photosensitive materials beyond conventional image making. This dual identity, artist and scientist, aesthete and experimenter, made Chambers an unusual figure in the photographic community of his time. It also positioned him uniquely to develop the specialized techniques that would eventually reveal the skeletal figure in the Harrison family portrait, techniques that combined artistic vision with scientific innovation in ways that would have been impossible for a practitioner grounded exclusively in either tradition. This is Chambers' studio as it appeared around 1905. Note the elaborate backdrops, the heavy camera equipment. Photography in this era was not casual or spontaneous. It was an event, carefully planned and executed. Chambers' studio occupied the ground floor of a handsome brick building at 42 Main Street. The large windows facing north provided the even, natural light preferred for portraiture in those days. Clients entered through a reception area where sample portraits were displayed in ornate frames. Behind a velvet curtain was the studio itself, with its painted backdrops, reflectors, and the imposing camera on its wooden tripod. The basement level housed Chambers' darkroom and chemical storage. Few people besides Chambers himself were allowed into this space, where he mixed the emulsions for his photographic plates and developed his images through a series of chemical baths. It was as much a laboratory as an artist's studio, and Chambers guarded his technical methods closely. According to local accounts, Chambers was something of an enigma in Blackwood, respected for his professional skills, yet never fully embraced by the community. He was, after all, an outsider, educated in the city, with sophisticated tastes and interests that set him apart from the typical small-town businessman. He spoke with a precision that some found pretentious. His clothes were always formal, dark suits, high collars, and neckties even on the hottest summer days. He was invariably polite, yet somehow distant, as if observing the town and its inhabitants through the same detached lens he used in his photography. What's interesting about this particular image is the clarity. Chambers was using what was likely a large format camera with glass plate negatives. The exposure time would have been relatively short for the period, perhaps 2 to 5 seconds. The family is posed in what we call the pyramid style, very common for the era. The father standing, the mother seated, the children arranged by height. See how no one is smiling? That wasn't just because exposures were long. That's a common misconception. By 1909, exposure times were short enough that people could smile if they wanted to. It was more about the solemnity of the occasion. A photograph was seen almost as a document of record, not a casual memento. The technical quality of this image is remarkable. Look at the tonal range, the gradations from light to dark, and the sharpness of the details. You can see the texture of James Harrison's wool suit, the lace on Eleanor's collar, even the slight scuff on young William's shoe. Chambers was clearly a master of his craft. He knew how to use light and shadow to create depth, how to position his subjects to create a balanced composition, and how to process the negative to bring out the finest details. What's particularly unusual about this photograph is that Chambers chose to shoot it on a glass plate negative, rather than on the newer, more convenient film that was becoming available by 1909. Glass plates were being phased out by then for all but the most demanding professional applications. They were heavier, more fragile, and more difficult to work with than film, but they produced images of unparalleled clarity and detail. The fact that Chambers selected this medium for the Harrison family portrait suggests he was planning something special, or perhaps something experimental. But what makes this photograph truly unusual is not what we can see, but what remained hidden for over a century. Infrared photography detects wavelengths of light that are invisible to the human eye. We use it in conservation to see underlying sketches in paintings or to read damaged texts. With photographs, it can sometimes reveal details that were either underexposed or have faded over time. But in all my years of work, I've never seen anything like this. The skeleton isn't just visible, it's detailed. You can see individual ribs, vertebrae, the delicate bones of the hands, and it's only visible under a very specific wavelength of infrared light. Move just outside that range, and it disappears completely. What disturbs me most is the anatomical accuracy. This isn't some vague, ghostly shape that could be dismissed as a chemical anomaly. This is a medically accurate human skeleton. I've consulted with forensic anthropologists who confirm that the skeletal proportions are consistent with an adult male, approximately 5'10" tall. The bone structure suggests someone between 30 and 50 years of age at time of death. There are no obvious pathologies or injuries visible in the skeletal figure. Nothing to indicate cause of death or identity. It's just there, a complete human skeleton, rendered with perfect anatomical precision, standing behind the Harrison family as if posing with them. The most chilling aspect is the position of the hand. It's not simply near or behind Thomas Harrison's shoulder. The phalanges, the finger bones, curve slightly, conforming to the shape of the boy's shoulder, as if gripping it. The thumb is positioned differently than the fingers, exactly as a living hand would be when holding something. The anatomical accuracy extends to the smallest details. The slight protrusion of the trapezium at the base of the thumb, the delicate articulation of the distal phalanges. This isn't a rough approximation of a hand. It's a perfect rendering of human anatomy. The discovery raised more questions than answers. Who was this skeletal figure? Why did it appear only under infrared analysis? And what was its connection to the Harrison family, particularly to young Thomas, upon whose shoulder its bony hand appeared to rest? To find answers, we needed to delve deeper into the history of the Harrisons. What happened to this family after the photograph was taken in the summer of 1909? Our investigation led us to a startling discovery. In December of 1909, just months after this photograph was taken, tragedy struck the Harrison family. Thomas Harrison, age 6, youngest son of prominent banker James Harrison and his wife Eleanor, passed away yesterday after a short but severe illness. Doctors attribute the cause to pneumonia, which has claimed several young lives in the area this winter. Young Thomas, the same child upon whose shoulder the skeletal hand rests in the infrared image, died less than 6 months after the photograph was taken. The Blackwood Gazette devoted considerable space to Thomas's funeral, an indication of the Harrison family's standing in the community. The article describes a somber procession from the Harrison home to St. Matthew's Church, the family carriage followed by those of Blackwood's leading citizens. Thomas's small casket, described as white oak with silver fittings, was carried by 4 pallbearers. Unusually, all were adult men rather than boys of similar age to the deceased, suggesting perhaps that the Harrisons had few close family connections in town. The service itself was conducted by Reverend Stephen Holloway, who reportedly spoke of the inscrutable ways of providence and the comfort of knowing that young Thomas now resides in heaven's eternal care. Eleanor Harrison was described as bearing her grief with quiet dignity, while James Harrison was noted as visibly shaken but steadfast in his support of his wife and remaining children. The article concludes by mentioning that the family would be withdrawing from society for a period of appropriate mourning, as was customary following the death of a child. Child mortality was significantly higher in that era. Pneumonia, diphtheria, scarlet fever, these were serious threats, especially to children. Even in wealthy families like the Harrisons, who had access to the best medical care available at the time, children succumbed to these illnesses. The winter of 1909-1910 was particularly harsh in New England. Blackwood's town records show that several other children died of respiratory illnesses that season. Medical care was primitive by our standards. No antibiotics, limited diagnostic capabilities, treatments that often did more harm than good. A doctor's visit typically involved little more than listening to the chest with a stethoscope, taking a pulse and prescribing bed rest, steam inhalations, and perhaps some laudanum to ease coughing and help the patient sleep. For a rapidly progressing infection like bacterial pneumonia, there was little that could be done. The Harrisons would have spared no expense in treating Thomas. They likely brought in specialists from Boston, perhaps even employed round-the-clock nurses. But medical science in 1909 simply didn't have the tools to combat serious bacterial infections. Many families lost children to these diseases. It was an expected tragedy of the era, one that parents lived in constant fear of, especially during the winter months when respiratory infections were most common. But was Thomas's death merely an unfortunate but common tragedy of the era, or was there something more sinister at play? According to the death certificate, Thomas died on December 12, 1909. The official cause was listed as pneumonia, but what's interesting is how quickly the illness progressed. According to these records, he went from seemingly healthy to critically ill in just 3 days. Even for pneumonia, that's an unusually rapid progression. In the pre-antibiotic era, pneumonia could certainly be fatal, but typically there would be a longer period of illness. A 3-day decline raises questions about the diagnosis. The attending physician was Dr. Charles Whitcomb, Blackwood's primary doctor for over 30 years at that point. By 1909, Dr. Whitcomb would have been in his 60s, well respected but perhaps not entirely current with the latest medical developments. His training would have predated the germ theory of disease, though by 1909 he would certainly have been aware of it. His diagnosis of pneumonia might have been accurate, but it could also have been a catch-all term for any severe respiratory illness. The symptoms described in his notes, rapid fever, shallow breathing, coughing up blood, delirium, could indeed indicate pneumonia, but they could also be consistent with other conditions. Tuberculosis, diphtheria, influenza with secondary infection, all were common and often fatal at the time. Without modern diagnostic tools, precise diagnosis was difficult, especially in rapidly progressing cases. What's particularly strange is the note in Dr. Whitcomb's records that Thomas had been in perfect health at his regular checkup just 2 weeks before his death. Most childhood pneumonia cases in the pre-antibiotic era followed a pattern of gradual onset, a cold that worsened over time, or a bout with influenza that weakened the lungs and left them vulnerable to secondary infection. Sudden onset pneumonia with no prior illness was less common, especially in an otherwise healthy child. But Thomas's death was just the beginning of the Harrison family's troubles. In 1911, 2 years after Thomas's death, his older brother William died in what was described as a swimming accident at a nearby lake. He was 14 years old. The Blackwood Gazette reported that William had gone swimming with friends at Lake Minnewaska, a popular recreation spot about 3 miles from town. According to witnesses, William had been swimming strongly toward a small island in the middle of the lake when he suddenly appeared to struggle and then disappeared beneath the surface. His friends immediately raised the alarm, and several adults who were picnicking nearby attempted to locate him, but by the time they reached the area where he had been seen, William had disappeared. The lake was dragged through the night, and William's body was recovered early the following morning. The coroner ruled the death an accidental drowning, noting that there were no signs of injury or foul play. Friends and teachers expressed shock, describing William as an excellent swimmer who had navigated the distance to the island many times before. One witness, Mrs. Helen Cartwright, was quoted as saying, "It was as if something pulled him under. One moment he was swimming strongly, the next he was gone." Then, in 1913, Catherine, the middle child and now the only surviving Harrison child, fell ill with symptoms similar to those that had claimed her younger brother. She died 3 days before her 14th birthday. The parallels between Catherine's illness and Thomas's were striking. Like her brother, Catherine went from apparent perfect health to critical condition in the span of just a few days. The symptoms were nearly identical: high fever, respiratory distress, coughing up blood, and like Thomas, she was attended by Dr. Whitcomb, who again diagnosed pneumonia. Catherine died at home, in her bedroom at the Harrison house on Maple Street, just as Thomas had. By this time, the Harrisons had become somewhat isolated in Blackwood, and Catherine's funeral was a smaller affair than Thomas's had been. The Blackwood Gazette noted that James Harrison appeared gaunt and aged beyond his years, and that Eleanor had to be supported by her lady's companion, having apparently taken a sedative to bear the unbearable grief of burying her last child. The article concluded with a note that the Harrisons would not be receiving visitors and requested privacy, as they grapple with a burden no parent should have to bear: the loss of all their precious children. 3 children from one family, all dying before reaching adulthood, even in that era, would have been considered extraordinarily unfortunate. People would have talked. There might have been whispers. The pattern of deaths, all 3 children, within a relatively short time span, under somewhat unusual circumstances, would certainly have raised eyebrows in a small town like Blackwood, in an era when superstition still held considerable sway, especially in rural New England with its history of witch trials and folklore. Some might have whispered about curses or divine retribution. Others might have looked for more worldly explanations. Perhaps there was something wrong with the Harrison house itself: contaminated water, toxic materials in the construction, something environmental that affected the children but not the adults. Or perhaps there was a hereditary condition, something carried in the family line that manifested in childhood or early adolescence. Without modern medical knowledge, people reached for explanations that made sense to them, from the scientific to the supernatural. Whatever the cause, the effect on the Harrisons' standing in the community was profound. The deaths cast a pall over what had once been a rising family. People tend to distance themselves from tragedy, either out of superstition or simply because they don't know how to respond. The Harrisons, once at the center of Blackwood society, increasingly found themselves on its margins, and talk they did. Our research uncovered evidence that by 1913, after the death of their last child, the Harrisons had become increasingly isolated in Blackwood society. The social announcements section of the Blackwood Gazette, which had once regularly featured the Harrisons at various community events, mentioned them less and less frequently after Thomas's death, and hardly at all after William's. By the time Catherine died, they had essentially disappeared from the town's social life. The Ladies' Reading Society, which Eleanor had founded, continued without her, now under the leadership of Mrs. Edith Prescott, wife of the town's most prominent physician. Local diaries and letters from the period reveal the changing attitudes toward the Harrison family. One woman wrote to her sister in Boston, "The poor Harrisons are seldom seen these days. Eleanor no longer attends church, and James walks to the bank with his eyes on the ground, speaking to no one. Their tragedy has made them strange to us, and us to them." Another resident, writing in his private journal, was less charitable. "Some say the Harrison misfortunes are divine judgment for their modern ways, and Eleanor's unwomanly interests in politics and social reform. Others whisper of family illness or even darker things. Whatever the truth, their presence in Blackwood now casts a shadow rather than sheds light." James Harrison resigned from the bank in 1914, selling his controlling interest to a business partner. The official reason given was ill health, but contemporary accounts suggest he had become a changed man, withdrawn, agitated, suspicious. Harrison's resignation letter, preserved in the bank's archives, cited persistent nervousness and fatigue that made it impossible to fulfill my duties to the high standard expected. His personal physician, Dr. Frederick Prescott, provided a supporting note diagnosing nervous exhaustion and recommending complete rest and removal from all business concerns. But bank employees and associates painted a different picture of Harrison's condition in private correspondence. The bank's head cashier, Samuel Thornton, wrote to his cousin, "Mr. Harrison is not himself these days. He starts at shadows, checks the locks repeatedly, and sometimes stops mid-sentence as if listening for something the rest of us cannot hear. Last Tuesday I found him in the vault, staring at nothing, and when I spoke his name, he whirled around with such terror in his eyes that I feared he might collapse." Poor Eleanor is a shadow of her former self. James scarcely leaves the house anymore, and when he does, he hurries along with his head down, avoiding all conversation. They have dismissed most of their staff, and the curtains at Maple Street remain drawn day and night. It is as if a darkness has settled over that once happy household. This observation comes from the diary of Margaret Whitley, a neighbor of the Harrisons who had once been close to Eleanor. Her diary entries track the Harrisons' withdrawal from society following the deaths of their children. Initially, she reports bringing food and offering comfort, as was customary in times of bereavement. But as time went on, her entries show increasing concern. Eleanor no longer answers the door herself, but sends the maid with excuses. When I caught a glimpse of her through the window yesterday, I hardly recognized her. She has aged 20 years in two, and her eyes hold a haunted look that I cannot bear to see. Later entries describe unusual activities at the Harrison home. Lights burn at all hours in the upstairs rooms. Strange visitors come and go, not doctors or ministers, but men carrying equipment in large cases. Last night I heard what sounded like a camera shutter clicking repeatedly, though who would be taking photographs at 3 in the morning I cannot imagine. And through it all, James paces the front garden, smoking cigarette after cigarette, jumping at every sound. By 1915, the Harrisons had sold their home on Maple Street and left Blackwood. Their destination was recorded as Boston, but our investigation found no trace of them there. It was as if the Harrisons had simply disappeared. The sale of the Harrison home was handled not by James himself, but by his attorney, a Mr. Philip Wardlow of Boston. The house and most of its contents were sold to a Dr. Samuel Eastman, who converted it into a private sanitarium. According to town records, the sale was completed in March of 1915, but the Harrisons had already vacated the property by January of that year, leaving behind furniture, clothing, and personal items that most families would have taken with them in a normal move. Neighbors reported that the Harrisons left in the middle of the night. Mrs. Whitley's diary entry for January 12, 1915 reads, "The Harrisons are gone. No word to anyone, not even a farewell. Their motor car was not used. Henry Adams says he was hired to drive them to the train station at midnight, with only 4 small valises between them. They looked, he said, like people fleeing rather than merely traveling, glancing over their shoulders, hurrying as if pursued. What could have driven them to such an extremity? When I learned about the fate of the Harrison children, particularly Thomas, I was chilled to the core. The skeleton in the infrared image was standing directly behind him, its hand on his shoulder, almost like a claim, and he was the first to die. I couldn't help but notice the correlation between the intensity of the skeletal image and the timing of each child's death. Thomas, with the skeletal hand directly touching him, died within months. William, who stands slightly apart in the photograph, lived another 2 years. And Catherine, the furthest from the skeletal figure, survived the longest. It could be coincidence, of course, but the pattern is disturbing. As a scientist, I'm trained to look for rational explanations. Could the photograph have captured some physical anomaly that modern medicine might identify? Perhaps Thomas already had the illness that would kill him, some underlying condition that Chambers' technique somehow visualized. But that wouldn't explain William's drowning or the similar deaths of all three children. I've spent hours studying this image, searching for some explanation that satisfies both the evidence and scientific reason. I haven't found it yet. The skeleton is there, undeniably present when viewed under the right conditions, its hand resting with apparent purpose on a child who would soon die. Whatever this image captured, whether it was a glimpse of something genuine or the product of some complex photographic technique, it remains one of the most disturbing artifacts I've ever encountered in my professional career. But who, or what, was this skeletal figure? And why did it appear only under infrared light, invisible to the naked eye and even to other forms of photographic analysis? There's a theory in paranormal research called the Herald of Death. It suggests that certain entities, whether you want to call them spirits, demons, or something else entirely, can mark their intended victims. These entities exist outside our normal perception but occasionally manifest in subtle ways. In various cultures throughout history, there are accounts of death omens that appear shortly before someone dies. The banshee in Irish folklore, the black dog in British mythology, the owl in some Native American traditions, all are said to presage death. What's interesting is how many of these traditions involve figures that are visible only to certain people, those with second sight or other special sensitivities. The emergence of spirit photography coincided with the rise of the spiritualist movement in the late 19th century. Spiritualism, the belief that the spirits of the dead can and do communicate with the living, gained tremendous popularity following the Civil War, as bereaved families sought connection with loved ones lost in the conflict. By the early 1900s, seances and mediumship had become widespread practices, attracting participants from all social classes and educational backgrounds, including prominent figures like Sir Arthur Conan Doyle, creator of the ultra-rational detective Sherlock Holmes. William H. Mumler is generally credited as the first spirit photographer, having produced an image in 1861 that appeared to show the transparent figure of a deceased relative standing behind his living subject, though Mumler was later charged with fraud and many of his methods debunked. The concept of capturing spiritual entities on photographic plates had captured the public imagination and spawned numerous imitators and investigators. What makes spirit photography particularly interesting in the context of the Harrison family portrait is the technical overlap between these supposedly supernatural images and the legitimate scientific applications of photography that were developing simultaneously. X-ray photography, discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895, demonstrated conclusively that photographic techniques could indeed capture phenomena invisible to the human eye. Infrared and ultraviolet photography, though still in their infancy in the early 1900s, suggested further expansions of photography's ability to reveal the unseen. This convergence of spiritual belief and scientific discovery created a unique cultural environment in which someone like Edward Chambers, trained in both medicine and photography, familiar with radiographic techniques, yet living in an era still permeated by supernatural beliefs, might develop a photographic method that blurred the boundaries between scientific imaging and what we would now call paranormal investigation. The Harrison family portrait exists at this precise intersection, a product of advanced technical knowledge that nevertheless produced an image that defies purely scientific explanation. The skeletal figure, with its anatomical accuracy and deliberate positioning, shares characteristics with both medical radiography and the supposed spirit photographs of the era. Whether we interpret it as an early form of medical imaging, a genuine capture of a supernatural entity, or some hybrid of the two, depends largely on our own framework for understanding the relationship between the visible and invisible worlds. A compelling theory, but one that lacks scientific foundation. We sought other explanations. One possibility is that the image isn't paranormal at all, but rather an unusual form of double exposure. Perhaps there was a medical illustration, an anatomical drawing, or even an X-ray, that somehow contaminated the photographic plate. X-ray technology was still relatively new in 1909, having been discovered by Wilhelm Röntgen in 1895. By the early 1900s, X-rays were being used medically, but the equipment was primarily found in hospitals and research institutions, not typically in small-town photography studios. X-ray images from this period were created by exposing a photographic plate to X-ray radiation as it passed through the subject, The resulting image showed bones and dense tissues as white or light gray against a darker background. The skeletal figure in the Harrison photograph has this same quality. The bones appear as light structures against the darker background of the infrared image. It's possible that Chambers used plates that had previously been exposed to X-rays, or perhaps he deliberately combined conventional photography with radiographic techniques. If he had access to X-ray equipment, perhaps through his medical connections, he might have been experimenting with layering different types of exposures. However, Edward Chambers, the photographer, might have had connections to medical institutions. Perhaps he used the same plates or chemicals for different purposes. It's speculative, but not impossible. The anatomical accuracy of the skeletal figure suggests medical knowledge. The positioning of the hand on Thomas Harrison's shoulder, with the fingers curved naturally around it, shows an understanding of how bones articulate and how a living hand would be positioned. This level of detail argues against a random chemical anomaly and points toward either deliberate creation or the capture of something actually present. From a purely scientific perspective, we have to consider all possibilities, including deliberate fraud. Chambers might have created this image intentionally, perhaps as an experiment in photographic techniques, or for reasons we can't determine. The infrared visibility could be due to specific chemicals that only become visible under certain wavelengths, something Chambers, with his reported interest in photography's scientific applications, might have developed. This theory prompted us to investigate Edward Chambers more thoroughly. Who was the man who captured this enigmatic image? Edward Chambers was born in 1865 in Philadelphia. Before establishing his photography studio in Blackwood, he had worked in several larger cities, including Boston and New York. His obituary mentioned that he had initially studied medicine before turning to photography, a detail that suddenly seemed significant. Chambers' background represented an unusual combination of influences and experiences that positioned him uniquely at the intersection of science, medicine, and art. His father, Dr. William Chambers, was a prominent Philadelphia surgeon whose practice catered to the city's elite and whose research on surgical techniques had earned him recognition throughout the medical community of the northeastern United States. The family's home on Rittenhouse Square placed young Edward at the center of Philadelphia's intellectual and social establishment, exposing him from an early age to the latest developments in science and medicine. Edward's early education reflected his father's expectation that he would follow in his footsteps. He attended the prestigious Phillips Exeter Academy in New Hampshire, where he excelled in mathematics and chemistry. His subsequent enrollment at the University of Pennsylvania School of Medicine in 1883 seemed to confirm his path toward becoming the next Dr. Chambers. For 3 years, he progressed through the medical curriculum with distinction, particularly in anatomy and physiology, subjects that required the precise observational skills that would later serve him well in photography. The pivotal moment in Chambers' life came during his 3rd year of medical training. While assisting his father in a surgical procedure, an amputation necessitated by severe infection in a patient's leg, Edward witnessed complications that led to the patient's death on the operating table. The incident is documented in his father's medical journal as a regrettable outcome despite adherence to proper procedure, but its impact on the younger Chambers appears to have been profound. Within weeks, he had withdrawn from medical school against his father's vehement objections. This rupture with his family's expectations and the medical tradition that had defined their status created a period of uncertainty in Chambers' life. Family correspondence from 1886 and 1887 reveals concern about his aimless wanderings and obsessive experiments with light and chemistry in a makeshift laboratory he established in a rented room far from the family home. It was during this period that he first encountered photography, not as an artistic medium, but as a scientific tool for documenting physical phenomena. Chambers' entry into professional photography came through an unusual route. In 1888, he secured a position as a technical assistant to Dr. Silas Mitchell, a neurologist pioneering the use of photography to document patients' physical conditions before and after treatment. This work rekindled Chambers' interest in medicine while channeling it through the more detached medium of photography. It also introduced him to the technical aspects of image creation, the chemistry of photosensitive materials, the physics of optics, the mechanics of camera operation. From this scientific foundation, Chambers gradually expanded into more conventional photography, undertaking formal training with established photographers in Philadelphia and later New York. But he never lost his interest in photography's potential as a diagnostic tool. His personal journals from this period, preserved in the University of Pennsylvania's archives, show his continuing experiments with specialized emulsions and filtering techniques designed to reveal aspects of his subjects that were invisible to conventional photography, experiments that prefigured the techniques he would later develop in Blackwood. By the time Chambers established himself as a portrait photographer, first in New York and later in Blackwood, he had developed a dual identity, publicly an artist creating beautiful images for his clients, privately a researcher continuing to explore photography's potential to penetrate beneath the visible surface of reality. This duality would find its most disturbing expression in the Harrison family portrait, where his artistic and scientific pursuits converged in an image that revealed far more than anyone had anticipated. Chambers was respected in Blackwood, but somewhat of an outsider. He never married, lived alone above his studio, and was described by contemporaries as scholarly and reserved. He was known to experiment with photographic techniques and to correspond with other photographers and scientists about advances in the field. Chambers wasn't unfriendly. Local accounts describe him as unfailingly polite and professional with clients, but he maintained a certain distance from Blackwood's social life. He didn't attend church, unusual for the time. He wasn't a member of the Masonic Lodge or other fraternal organizations that were the center of male social activity. He occasionally gave lectures at the library on the science of photography, but declined invitations to join the town's cultural societies. His solitary habits gave rise to some speculation among Blackwood's more gossip-prone residents. Some suggested that he had left the city following a failed romance or family scandal. Others, noting his unusual hours and the strange smells sometimes emanating from his studio basement, whispered about alchemy or other esoteric pursuits. Most, however, simply regarded him as an eccentric, talented and harmless, if somewhat peculiar in his habits and interests. His studio was unusually well equipped for a small-town photographer. Visitors noted his extensive library of technical books and journals. He was particularly interested in new applications of photography in scientific and medical fields. Chambers' studio stood apart from the typical portrait galleries of the era, where most photographers of the time displayed family portraits and wedding pictures. Chambers' reception area featured scientific photographs, microscopic images of plant cells, astronomical photographs of the moon and planets, and studies of light and motion. His equipment was state-of-the-art, much of it custom-built to his specifications by manufacturers in Boston and New York. His darkroom contained an array of chemicals uncommon in standard photographic practice. A visiting photographer from Boston remarked in his journal that Chambers' chemical cabinet contained substances more appropriate to a research laboratory than a portrait studio. Chambers explained these as necessary for his experimental processes, though he was vague about the nature of these experiments. Most intriguing was a second camera that several clients mentioned seeing in the studio but which was never used for their portraits. Described as unusual in design with multiple lenses and attachments, this camera was apparently reserved for Chambers' personal research. When questioned about it, he reportedly dismissed it as a failed experiment or a prototype still in development. But our investigation revealed something even more intriguing about Edward Chambers. Before moving to Blackwood, he had briefly worked as a technical assistant at Massachusetts General Hospital in Boston, in their newly established radiology department. Hospital records from 1896 to 1898 list Edward Chambers as a photographic technician in the radiology department. This was during the very earliest days of X-ray technology in America. Massachusetts General was one of the first hospitals in the country to establish a dedicated X-ray department following Röntgen's discovery in 1895. Chambers would have been involved in the pioneering work of adapting this new technology to medical use. Dr. Walter Bradford, the head of the department during Chambers' time there, made several references to him in his published papers on early radiographic techniques. In one, he credits Chambers with significant improvements to the photographic process used to capture the X-ray images, resulting in greater clarity and detail. Another paper mentions Chambers' innovative approach to reducing exposure times while maintaining image quality, suggesting that Chambers was more than just a technician. He was actively contributing to the development of radiographic methods. A letter of recommendation written by Dr. Bradford when Chambers left the hospital describes him as exceptionally talented in both the technical and theoretical aspects of radiographic imaging, but also notes that his tendency to pursue unorthodox experimental paths, while occasionally yielding remarkable results, has at times conflicted with the department's more structured research protocols. This suggests that even in the experimental environment of early radiology, Chambers may have been pushing boundaries that his superiors found concerning. In other words, Edward Chambers had direct experience with X-ray technology, the very technology that visualizes human skeletons. Chambers' expertise in radiography would have given him a unique perspective on photography's capacity to reveal what lies beneath the visible surface. He would have witnessed firsthand how X-rays could penetrate flesh to reveal the skeletal structure beneath, a process that must have seemed almost magical in the late 1890s, even to those with scientific training. He would have been familiar with the chemicals and processes used to capture X-ray images on photographic plates. He would have understood the properties of different emulsions, the effects of various wavelengths of radiation, and the techniques for enhancing or manipulating the resulting images. This knowledge, combined with his formal medical education and his continuing experiments in photography, positioned him at a unique intersection of art, science, and medicine. And perhaps most significantly, he would have been aware of the potential dangers of this new technology. The early days of radiology were marked by a lack of understanding about radiation's harmful effects. Many pioneering radiologists and technicians suffered radiation burns, cancer, and other conditions as a result of unprotected exposure. Chambers, working in the field during this period, would likely have witnessed these effects firsthand, an experience that might well have influenced his later writings about what it reveals, it also invites. This connection to radiology is fascinating. It suggests that Chambers might have had knowledge of or access to radiographic materials, but it still doesn't explain how a skeletal image could appear on a family portrait, visible only under infrared light. X-rays and infrared radiation are different parts of the electromagnetic spectrum. X-rays have much higher energy and shorter wavelengths than infrared radiation. They interact with matter in fundamentally different ways. X-rays penetrate soft tissue, but are blocked by denser materials like bone, creating the familiar skeletal images. Infrared light is absorbed and reflected based on an object's heat and certain chemical properties. There's no obvious scientific reason why an image created with X-ray technology would appear only when viewed with infrared light, unless Chambers was conducting some kind of experiment, combining conventional photography with radiographic techniques. Perhaps he was using chemicals that were sensitive to both X-rays and infrared light, or maybe he developed a method to transfer X-ray images onto conventional photographic plates in a way that made them visible only under certain conditions. It would have been highly experimental, certainly beyond the standard photographic practices of the time, but not impossible given his unique background in both medical radiography and photographic chemistry. The question remains, if this was an experiment, what was its purpose? And why conduct it on a portrait of the Harrison family, particularly with a focus on young Thomas? Was Chambers attempting to develop a new diagnostic technique, or was there something more personal, more targeted in his approach? The possibility that Edward Chambers was experimenting with early radiographic techniques led us to a new line of inquiry. Was the skeleton in the photograph the result of some photographic experiment gone wrong? Or was it something more deliberate? Our investigation brought us to the Blackwood Historical Society, where we hope to find more information about both Chambers and the Harrison family. We have a small collection of Edward Chambers' personal papers. They were donated after his death by a distant cousin who inherited his estate. They've never been fully cataloged. Not much interest in an old photographer's notes, I'm afraid. The papers came to us in the late 1940s, along with some of his photographic equipment and a few glass plate negatives, mostly landscapes and architectural studies of Blackwood, nothing remarkable. The personal papers include correspondence, some financial records, and several notebooks containing what appear to be research notes and experimental records. They're quite technical, filled with chemical formulas and exposure calculations that mean little to a layperson like myself. What's curious is that there's a gap in the materials. The correspondence and financial records cover Chambers' entire time in Blackwood, from 1898 until his departure in 1915. But the research notebooks stop abruptly in the summer of 1909, around the time the Harrison family portrait was taken, and don't resume until early 1910. It's as if there was another notebook or set of records from that crucial period that isn't part of our collection. There's also a curious notation in our acquisition record. The cousin who donated the materials initially included something called the special apparatus in the donation, but then withdrew it before the transfer was completed. The record doesn't specify what this apparatus was, only that the donor decided at the last minute that it should be destroyed as per EC's instructions. Whether this referred to Chambers' will or some other directive, we don't know. What we discovered in Chambers' personal papers was astonishing. The earliest notebook in the collection, dated 1898-1899, contained detailed notes on Chambers' experiments with various photographic emulsions and their sensitivity to different wavelengths of light. Many entries referenced his time at Massachusetts General, comparing standard photographic techniques with the specialized methods used in radiography. One passage stood out. Ours discovery has opened a window not just into the body's interior, but perhaps into other realms previously invisible to science. If light of one frequency can reveal bones, what might other frequencies reveal? What else might exist beyond our limited perception? A later notebook from 1902 documented Chambers' early experiments with infrared-sensitive emulsions. Most photographers of the era had little interest in infrared photography. The equipment was cumbersome, the chemicals unstable, and the practical applications limited. But Chambers was methodically testing different compounds, recording their sensitivity to various wavelengths, and developing techniques to stabilize the resulting images. One entry noted, "Success with compound K17. Plate remains sensitive to normal spectrum, but also records impressions at 750, 900 nanonym when properly treated. Images only visible when viewed through corresponding filter. My experiments with the new emulsion continue to yield promising results. When treated with the solution and exposed to the specified light frequency, the latent image becomes visible. I am convinced this technique could revolutionize diagnostic photography, revealing what lies beneath without the harmful effects of excessive X-ray exposure." This entry, from a notebook dated early 1909, marked a turning point in Chambers' research. Previous entries had focused on the technical aspects of his photographic experiments, chemical formulations, exposure times, development techniques. But here he began to suggest medical applications for his work, drawing on his interrupted medical training and his experience in radiography. Subsequent entries detailed his refinement of what he called the dual plate system, a modified camera that could simultaneously create a conventional photograph and a specialized image on a treated plate. He described a complex arrangement of filters, mirrors, and chemical baths that would allow him to capture both visible light and infrared radiation in a single exposure. The technical details were precise, suggesting that Chambers had actually constructed this apparatus and tested it successfully. The entries became increasingly focused on potential diagnostic applications. Chambers noted that certain health conditions caused subtle changes in body temperature or altered the reflection and absorption of infrared radiation by the body's tissues. He theorized that his technique might detect these changes before visible symptoms appeared, allowing for earlier diagnosis and treatment of various diseases. This suggests Chambers was developing some kind of alternative to X-ray imaging, perhaps using infrared or near-infrared wavelengths to penetrate tissue to a limited degree. This was decades ahead of modern medical imaging techniques. What Chambers appears to be describing is conceptually similar to thermography or near-infrared spectroscopy, techniques that weren't developed until much later in the 20th century. Modern medical thermography uses infrared radiation to map variations in body temperature, which can indicate inflammation, restricted blood flow, or other abnormalities. Near-infrared spectroscopy can provide information about tissue oxygenation and other physiological parameters. If Chambers had indeed developed a functional version of such technology in 1909, it would represent a remarkable innovation. The ability to detect physiological changes without the harmful radiation of X-rays would have been revolutionary. Yet his technique seems to have been lost to history, either because it didn't work as he hoped, or because something about the results led him to abandon or suppress his research. The dual plate system he describes is particularly interesting. Modern specialized photography often uses multiple exposures or simultaneous capture of different wavelengths to create composite images that reveal more than any single exposure could. Chambers seems to have developed a primitive version of this approach, custom-built for his specific purposes. J.H. has agreed to bring his family to the studio next week. They will be ideal subjects for the experiment. The boy especially shows the early signs I have learned to recognize. Whether his parents have noticed yet, I cannot say. The camera is prepared with the dual plate system. If successful, the conventional exposure will reveal nothing unusual to the family. while the treated plate should capture what lies beneath. God help me if I am right. This entry, dated just days before the Harrison family portrait session, revealed Chambers' specific interest in the family. The reference to J.H., James Harrison, and the boy, presumably Thomas, suggested that Chambers had observed something concerning about the child's health, something that he believed his specialized photographic technique might document. The tone of the entry was troubling, both clinical in its approach to the family as subjects and emotionally fraught in its concluding prayer. Chambers seemed to be both eager to test his technique and apprehensive about what it might reveal. The phrase, "what lies beneath," could refer literally to internal physical conditions, but its ambiguity, coupled with, "God help me if I am right," hinted at darker possibilities. Most concerning was the implication that Chambers had identified health concerns in young Thomas that even his parents had not noticed. What had he seen, and why did he believe that the Harrisons, specifically, would be ideal subjects for his experiment? J.H., James Harrison, and the boy, presumably Thomas, who would die of a rapid illness just months later. The timing was undeniable. Chambers photographed the Harrison family in the summer of 1909. His notes indicated that he had observed concerning signs in young Thomas, and in December of that same year, Thomas died of a rapidly progressing illness officially diagnosed as pneumonia. The correlation seemed too precise to be coincidental, but Chambers' notes suggested more than mere observation. The reference to the family as ideal subjects, and his uncertainty about whether the parents had noticed yet, implied that he had identified something specific about Thomas's condition, something that his specialized photography might document in a way that conventional medical examination could not. If Chambers had indeed detected early signs of the illness that would kill Thomas, it raised profound questions. Had he warned the family? Had he shared his concerns with Thomas's physician? Or had he simply observed and documented, treating the situation as a test case for his experimental technique, rather than a matter of a child's health and life? What lies beneath? He wasn't talking about creating a double exposure. He believed he was capturing something actually present but invisible to normal sight. This phrase is particularly telling. In medical imaging, we often speak of revealing what lies beneath the surface: organs, bones, tumors, all the structures normally hidden from view. But Chambers seems to be suggesting something beyond normal anatomy. The combination of specialized photography and his apparent ability to detect illness before conventional symptoms appeared points to a technique that somehow visualized disease processes or physiological changes invisible to the naked eye. But why would such changes appear as a skeletal figure? If Chambers was developing some form of medical thermography or spectroscopy, we would expect the resulting images to show variations in temperature or tissue composition, perhaps areas of inflammation or altered blood flow, appearing as patches of different intensity or color. A clearly defined skeletal figure with anatomically correct features doesn't align with how such imaging typically works. Unless, of course, what Chambers captured wasn't physical at all. His notes become increasingly ambiguous about exactly what his technique was revealing. The shift from purely technical descriptions to phrases like, "God help me if I am right," suggests that his discoveries were taking him into territory that challenged his scientific understanding, perhaps even his conception of reality itself. The boy succumbed yesterday, exactly as I feared. The markers were there in the image, the hand upon his shoulder. I tried to warn them in my way, but J.H. dismissed my concerns as morbid fantasy. Now I must live with the knowledge that I saw death's approach and could not prevent it. The question remains, is it merely diagnostic, or does the process somehow summon the very thing it reveals? This entry, dated December 13, 1909, the day after Thomas Harrison's death, revealed the full extent of Chambers' distress. The markers he referred to could only be the skeletal figure visible in the infrared version of the photograph, with its hand resting on Thomas's shoulder. Chambers had interpreted this image not simply as an indication of illness, but as death itself making a claim on the child. His admission that he tried to warn them in my way suggested that Chambers had indeed attempted to alert the Harrisons to his concerns, but had perhaps been too vague or too cautious in his warnings. James Harrison's dismissal of these warnings as morbid fantasy indicated that Chambers had not fully explained what he had seen or how he had seen it, perhaps fearing that a direct revelation would be met with disbelief or worse. Most disturbing was Chambers' final question. whether his photographic process merely revealed death's approach or somehow facilitated it. This suggested a growing fear that his technique was not passive observation, but active intervention, that the act of capturing the image might somehow influence or accelerate the outcome. This fear would become a central theme in his subsequent writings. These entries painted a disturbing picture. Edward Chambers appeared to believe that his photographic technique wasn't just revealing a medical condition. He thought it was showing death itself, personified as a skeletal figure. As we continued through the notebooks, Chambers' entries showed a man increasingly troubled by his discovery. The precise technical descriptions of his earlier work gave way to more philosophical and even spiritual reflections. He began to question the nature of death, the boundaries between the visible and invisible worlds, and his own role in what he had set in motion. One entry, dated January 1910, read, "If death can be seen approaching through the lens, does that mean it has physical form? Or does the act of observation itself create a manifestation where none existed before? The uncertainty consumes me. I have locked away the apparatus and the treated plates, but the image remains burned into my mind. The skeletal hand, so precisely positioned, so deliberately placed, not random, not accidental, purposeful." Another from February 1910 showed his growing reluctance to continue his experiments. "I have been approached by Dr. Whitcomb to photograph a patient with an unusual growth, a perfect opportunity to test the diagnostic potential of the technique. I declined, citing equipment problems. The truth is, I cannot bear the possibility of seeing that figure again, of perhaps facilitating another visitation. Science demands that I continue, that I document and analyze without superstition or fear. But something stronger than scientific curiosity now governs my actions. Call it conscience, call it terror." From a scientific perspective, it's possible Chambers had developed some rudimentary form of medical imaging that could detect serious illness before external symptoms appeared. Perhaps Thomas already had the pneumonia infection when the photograph was taken, but wasn't yet showing symptoms. Certain infections can incubate for weeks before producing noticeable symptoms. If Thomas was already infected in the summer when the photograph was taken, it's conceivable that Chambers' technique somehow detected physiological changes associated with the early stages of the disease, perhaps subtle changes in body temperature or tissue composition that his specialized photography could capture. But the specific manifestation, a skeletal figure with its hand on Thomas's shoulder, is difficult to explain in purely scientific terms. If Chambers' technique was detecting disease, we would expect it to show some kind of abnormality in the affected area, perhaps the lungs in the case of pneumonia, not an external figure apparently reaching toward the patient. This disconnect between what we would expect from medical imaging and what actually appears in the photograph is what makes this case so perplexing. Either Chambers' technique was capturing something entirely different from what he initially intended, or the interpretation of the image, the perception of it as a skeletal figure, represents a subjective overlay on whatever physiological phenomenon was actually being recorded. But Chambers clearly believed something more supernatural was happening, and these later entries suggest he felt responsible in some way for what followed. His notes reveal a man torn between scientific rationality and a growing fear that he had discovered something beyond scientific explanation. The suggestion that his process might summon the very thing it reveals indicates a belief that the act of observation itself, or at least his particular method of observation, might influence outcomes rather than merely recording them. This belief aligns with certain concepts in quantum physics, where observation is understood to affect the behavior of subatomic particles. But Chambers was working decades before such theories were widely accepted, and he was applying the concept not to quantum mechanics, but to human mortality, suggesting that observing death's approach might somehow hasten its arrival. From a psychological perspective, Chambers' increasing distress might represent the natural guilt of someone who detected a fatal illness but was unable to prevent the death that followed. Medical professionals often experience this kind of guilt, even when they've done everything possible for a patient. But Chambers' writing suggests something more profound, a belief that his actions had not merely failed to prevent death, but had somehow facilitated it. As we continued through Chambers' notebooks, we found references to the other Harrison children as well. The elder boy has joined his brother. The parents sought me out, demanding to know if I had foreseen this as well. I showed them nothing, but in truth, when I examined the original plates after the younger one passed, I found traces around the elder boy too. Fainter, as if more distant but unmistakable. The sister's image remains clear, for now. God forgive me for what I have done. This entry, dated July 1911, shortly after William Harrison's drowning, revealed a crucial development. Following Thomas's death, Chambers had apparently re-examined the original photographic plates from the family portrait and discovered that William, too, showed signs of the skeletal figure's presence. Fainter, as if more distant, but unmistakable. The implication was clear. Chambers now believed that his photograph had captured not just Thomas's impending death, but William's as well, and that the relative clarity or intensity of the skeletal image correlated with the timing of each death. Thomas, with the skeletal hand directly touching him, died within months. William, with a fainter manifestation, lived about 2 years longer. Most disturbing was Chambers' observation about Catherine. The sister's image remains clear for now. This suggested that he had not detected signs of the skeletal figure around her in his initial review, implying that she might be spared the fate that had claimed her brothers. Yet his concluding prayer, "God forgive me for what I have done," hinted at a growing fear that all 3 children were at risk because of his photographic intervention. The entry also revealed that James and Eleanor Harrison had directly confronted Chambers after William's death, suggesting that his earlier warnings about Thomas, however vague, had made enough of an impression that they returned to him seeking answers when their second child died. His admission that he showed them nothing, despite his growing concerns, raised troubling questions about his ethical choices in this increasingly tragic situation. The last child is gone. J.H. came to the studio last night, wild-eyed and reeking of whiskey. He knows, or suspects. He spoke of curses and claiming hands, asked if the process could be reversed. I told him truthfully that I do not know what forces are at work, only that once seen, the shadow does not relent. He threatened to expose me, but who would believe such a tale? Who would believe that a photograph could mark a family for death? This entry, dated October 1913, just after Catherine's death, captured the culmination of the tragedy. Despite Chambers' earlier hope that Catherine might be spared, she too had died, completing the destruction of the Harrison family. James Harrison's late-night confrontation with Chambers revealed both his desperation and his growing suspicion about the photographer's role in his children's deaths. Harrison's specific references to curses and claiming hands suggested that he had somehow learned about or glimpsed the skeletal figure in the photograph. Perhaps Chambers had finally shown him the infrared image, or perhaps Harrison had discovered the treated photographic plates during his increasingly frantic search for explanations as his children died one by one. The question about whether the process could be reversed indicated that Harrison had come to believe what Chambers himself feared, that the photograph had not merely documented, but somehow influenced or even caused his children's deaths. And Chambers' response, that once seen, the shadow does not relent, offered no hope or comfort, only a fatalistic acceptance of the inexorable progression that had claimed all 3 Harrison children. Harrison's threat to expose Chambers revealed both the depth of his grief and rage, and the impossibility of his situation. As Chambers noted, who would believe such a tale? What court or authority would accept that a photograph had somehow marked a family for death? Harrison was left with an explanation he believed but could never prove, and a grief for which he could find no justice or resolution. These entries suggest that Chambers believed his photographic technique had done more than merely reveal the Harrison children's fates. He feared it had somehow caused or accelerated them. Chambers' notes traced his evolution from scientific curiosity to horrified self-recrimination. What had begun as an experiment in medical imaging, perhaps even with the benevolent intention of developing a diagnostic tool that could detect illness earlier and without the dangers of X-rays, had become, in his mind, something darker and more devastating. His initial excitement about the technique's potential gave way to growing unease as Thomas died, then to alarm when William followed, and finally to despair and guilt when Catherine completed the tragic sequence. With each death, his conviction grew that his photographic process had not merely observed but influenced these outcomes, that the act of capturing the skeletal figure in his specialized photograph had somehow given it power or purpose. This belief was reflected in his increasingly metaphysical language. Terms like summoning and relentless shadow replaced the technical vocabulary of his earlier entries. References to divine forgiveness and his own culpability supplanted the objective tone of scientific documentation. By the time of Catherine's death, Chambers was writing not as a detached experimenter, but as a man haunted by the consequences of his actions, convinced that he had opened a door that could not be closed. There's a concept in various magical traditions called sympathetic magic, the idea that creating an image or representation of something creates a connection to the real thing. In some cultures, this is why people fear having their photograph taken. They believe it captures a piece of their soul or essence. This belief is found across diverse cultures and historical periods. In some indigenous societies, individuals refuse to be photographed because they believe the image can be used to harm them through magical practices. Similar concerns existed in Victorian England, where spirit photography first emerged. The idea that a photograph could capture not just a person's likeness, but something of their essence or spirit. The concept extends beyond photography. Voodoo dolls, for instance, operate on the principle that creating a representation of a person establishes a connection through which influence can be exerted. Certain folk healing traditions involve making drawings or models of afflicted body parts, then destroying or healing the representation to affect the actual condition. What's interesting about Chambers' case is that he seems to have arrived at this ancient magical concept through modern scientific means. He began with a rational approach, developing a specialized photographic technique to visualize aspects of physical reality invisible to the naked eye. But as events unfolded, his understanding shifted towards something more primal, the fear that by creating an image of death's approach, he had established a channel through which it could more easily reach its targets. If we entertain Chambers' apparent belief, perhaps his specialized photographic technique didn't just capture an image of death's approach. It created a link, a doorway through which it could enter more easily. This interpretation aligns with certain esoteric traditions that view specialized states of awareness, including technological extensions of perception like Chambers' infrared photography, as potentially opening passages between different layers or aspects of reality. By developing a method to see what was normally invisible, Chambers may have inadvertently created a two-way connection, allowing what he observed to become aware of being observed. The specificity of the skeletal figure's interaction with Thomas, the deliberate placement of the hand on his shoulder, suggests intention rather than random manifestation. If we accept Chambers' evolving belief, this wasn't merely a passive recording of something present but invisible. It was the documentation of an active engagement, a claiming or marking that his technique somehow facilitated. The progression of deaths following the pattern revealed in Chambers' re-examination of the photographic plates, Thomas first, then William, finally Catherine, reinforces this interpretation. The skeletal figure wasn't simply present in the photograph. It was indicating a sequence, a plan that subsequently unfolded in the physical world exactly as the image had suggested it would. Or more rationally, Chambers had developed a technique that could detect serious underlying health conditions before they became symptomatic. The children may have already been ill when photographed. The skeletal hand might have been his way of marking areas of concern, perhaps overlaid through double exposure. From a medical perspective, there are several possible explanations for what Chambers might have actually detected. Thomas could have had an early-stage respiratory infection or tuberculosis, conditions that might not show obvious symptoms, but could cause subtle changes in body temperature or tissue composition that Chambers' infrared technique might have visualized. William and Catherine might have shared a genetic predisposition to certain illnesses, perhaps a congenital heart defect or immune system vulnerability that made them susceptible to particular infections. If all three children inherited the same condition, it would explain why they all died young, though from apparently different causes. The varying intensity of the skeletal figure in Chambers' subsequent examinations of the photographic plates might reflect different stages of disease progression in each child at the time the photograph was taken. Thomas, already showing clear signs that Chambers could detect, died within months. William, with less advanced indicators, lived longer. Catherine, showing no signs initially, survived the longest but eventually succumbed to whatever condition affected her brothers. His guilt and increasingly supernatural interpretation might have been his mind's way of processing the trauma of being unable to save these children despite having detected their illnesses. Medical professionals sometimes develop a sense of responsibility for outcomes beyond their control. Chambers had abandoned his medical training after a traumatic experience. He then developed a diagnostic technique that allowed him to detect serious illness before conventional medicine could. only to find himself unable to use this knowledge to prevent the deaths he foresaw. The psychological impact of this sequence would be profound for anyone, but especially for someone who had already experienced a crisis of confidence in medical intervention. His shift from scientific language to more supernatural explanations might represent a coping mechanism, a way to make sense of a situation where his scientific understanding provided no comfort or resolution. By recasting the events in terms of forces beyond human control, he could perhaps mitigate his own sense of failure and responsibility. The skeletal hand imagery itself might be a metaphorical representation rather than a literal description of what his technique revealed. Perhaps what he actually saw were patches of altered tissue density or temperature that his troubled mind interpreted as a skeletal figure. A classic case of pareidolia, the tendency to perceive meaningful patterns in ambiguous stimuli, influenced by his medical background and growing anxiety about the Harrison children. Whether Chambers' technique was truly capturing something supernatural, or merely detecting illness through some innovative but scientifically explainable method, one thing was clear: the Harrison family portrait harbored a dark secret for over a century. The photograph itself, with its dual nature, a conventional family portrait to normal view, a harbinger of death when examined with specialized equipment, embodied the essential mystery of this case. Was it a remarkable scientific artifact, an early prototype of medical imaging techniques that would not be developed for decades? Or was it something more unsettling, a window into forces beyond scientific understanding, a moment when the veil between the seen and unseen worlds was briefly penetrated? The fate of the Harrison family, 3 children dead within 4 years, parents fled and eventually deceased themselves, could not be disputed. The correlation between the skeletal figure in the infrared image and the sequence of deaths was too precise to dismiss as coincidence. But correlation is not causation, and the precise relationship between the photograph and the subsequent tragedies remained ambiguous, subject to interpretation through either scientific or supernatural frameworks. Chambers' own interpretation evolved from scientific curiosity to supernatural dread, his notes tracing a journey from rational investigation to haunted belief in forces beyond human comprehension or control. Whether this evolution reflected genuine insight into the true nature of his discovery, or the psychological impact of witnessing a tragedy he felt powerless to prevent, was impossible to determine with certainty. What remained was the photograph itself, a seemingly ordinary family portrait that, when viewed through the right equipment under the right conditions, revealed something extraordinary. 100 years later, it continued to raise profound questions about what photography can capture, what reality consists of, and whether our attempts to see beyond normal perception might sometimes reveal things we would be better off not seeing. The final question that haunted me was, what happened to the Harrisons after they left Blackwood? And did Chambers continue his experiments? After discovering the connection between the infrared image and the deaths of the Harrison children, I couldn't help wondering about the parents. If the skeletal figure had claimed all 3 children, had it finished with the family? Or were James and Eleanor Harrison also marked in some way that Chambers hadn't initially detected or reported? And what about Chambers himself? His notes revealed a growing fear that his photographic technique had opened some kind of door or established a connection with forces beyond normal perception. Did he continue his experiments despite this fear? Did he attempt to use his technique to understand or perhaps even counteract whatever he believed he had set in motion? Or did he abandon his research entirely, hoping that by doing so he might close the door he feared he had opened? From a scientific perspective, I wanted to know whether any traces of his technique survived, whether his equipment, his chemical formulations, or detailed records of his methods might still exist somewhere, potentially offering insights into what he had actually discovered. From a human perspective, I wondered how he lived with the burden of his belief that he had somehow contributed to the deaths of 3 children. Our investigation followed both threads, beginning with the fate of James and Eleanor Harrison after they left Blackwood in 1915. Records show that the Harrisons did initially relocate to Boston, as reported. James found work as a clerk at a financial firm, a significant step down from his previous position as a bank owner. Eleanor, once active in social causes, appears to have withdrawn from public life entirely. The financial firm, Merrill & Stanton, specialized in managing investments for wealthy New England families. James Harrison's position there was secured through a connection with Herbert Merrill, a former classmate from his college days at Harvard. Employment records describe Harrison as competent but reserved, and note that he declines all social invitations and appears uninterested in advancement. His salary was modest, particularly compared to his former status as a bank owner, suggesting that financial necessity rather than ambition drove his employment. Eleanor Harrison's withdrawal from public life represented a dramatic change for a woman once known for her progressive activism and social engagement. Boston women's organizations of the era, which would have welcomed someone of her background and interests, have no record of her participation. She did not join any of the city's literary societies, charitable organizations, or suffrage groups, despite having been actively involved in similar causes in Blackwood. They lived in a modest apartment on Commonwealth Avenue, again, a far cry from their grand home in Blackwood. But by the 1920 census, they no longer appear at this address. In fact, they seem to disappear from official records entirely. The apartment at 347 Commonwealth Avenue was a third-floor walk-up in a once grand building that had been subdivided into smaller units. Comfortable but not luxurious, and certainly a significant downgrade from their Blackwood mansion. City directories list them at this address from 1915 through 1917, but subsequent editions no longer include them. Rent records from the building manager show that they paid regularly but kept to themselves and received no visitors. Their departure in late 1917 was noted as abrupt, with no forwarding address provided. The 1920 U.S. Census, which should have recorded them if they remained in the country, has no listing for James and Eleanor Harrison or any variation of their names that matches their biographical details. Tax records, property registrations, voter rolls, all the usual paper trails that document a person's existence, show no trace of them after 1917. It was as if they had made a deliberate effort to disappear from official record-keeping systems. After weeks of searching, we finally found a clue, a passenger manifest from 1917 showing James and Eleanor Harrison boarding a ship bound for England. Their listed address was in London. The manifest for the SS Carpathia, sailing from Boston to Liverpool on November 7, 1917, listed James Harrison, 47, banker, and Eleanor Harrison, 45, housewife, among its passengers. Their stated destination was London, indefinite stay, suggesting they had no immediate plans to return to America. What makes this record particularly interesting is that it appears to be the only official document from this period that doesn't show signs of the Harrisons attempting to obscure their identities or movements. The timing of their departure is significant. November 1917, during World War I, was an unusual and potentially dangerous time for civilians to cross the Atlantic. German U-boats were actively targeting passenger vessels, and many Americans had postponed European travel until after the conflict. The Harrisons' decision to undertake such a journey during wartime suggests a powerful motivation, perhaps a desire to put as much distance as possible between themselves and Blackwood, regardless of the risks involved. British records show the Harrisons took up residence in a small cottage in Cornwall, on England's remote southwestern coast. They lived there under slightly altered names. Harrison became Harris, suggesting they wanted to distance themselves from their past. Cornwall was an interesting choice, remote, rural, far from London and other major cities. The area's rugged coastline, small fishing villages, and ancient myths and legends created an atmosphere very different from either Boston or Blackwood. It was a place where newcomers, particularly Americans, would be noticed, but also where privacy might be respected. A community small enough to provide security through familiarity, but traditional enough to discourage intrusive questions about one's past. Their decision to alter their name from Harrison to Harris, subtle but significant, reinforced the impression that they sought to make a break with their previous life without completely fabricating new identities. Local records in the parish of St. Just list them as James and Eleanor Harris, American nationals, and note their purchase of Rose Cottage in December 1917, a small stone house set back from the coastal road, with views of the Atlantic stretching toward the homeland they had left behind. This is the cottage where they lived until their deaths, Eleanor in 1925 and James in 1928. According to local church records, they kept to themselves, rarely venturing into the village. They were described by neighbors as private and somber. Rose Cottage still stands today, a simple two-bedroom dwelling built of local granite with a slate roof and small garden. Current owners report persistent cold spots in the main bedroom and occasional unexplained sounds. though they attribute these to the building's age and exposure to coastal winds rather than supernatural causes. Parish records and accounts from longtime residents describe the Harrisons, or Harrises, as polite but distant neighbors who participated minimally in community life. They attended Christmas services at the parish church, but no other religious functions. They purchased supplies from local shops, but never lingered to chat. They employed a local woman, Mary Trevelyan, to clean once a week, but, according to her granddaughter, they never spoke of America or their life before Cornwall, and the upstairs rooms were always kept locked. Eleanor's health apparently declined significantly in the mid-1920s. Dr. Richard Penrose, the local physician, visited regularly in her final months. His case notes describe a wasting illness of uncertain origin and mention that she frequently speaks of children waiting for her, though the couple is childless, according to husband. She died in March 1925, with her death certificate listing general debility and heart failure as the cause, a common but vague diagnosis for that era. James survived his wife by 3 years, becoming even more reclusive after her death. Neighbors reported that he rarely left the cottage during this period, with supplies being delivered by arrangement with local merchants. When seen outside, usually at dusk, he was described as gaunt and watchful, always looking over his shoulder. His own health deteriorated rapidly in early 1928, with Dr. Penrose's notes mentioning acute respiratory distress similar to wife's final illness, and patients' insistence that it has found me at last. James Harris, formerly of America, passed away peacefully at home on March 3, 1928. He is survived by no one, his wife and 3 children having preceded him in death. Per his wishes, he will be interred next to his wife at St. Mary's Churchyard. The cottage and remaining possessions revert to the estate of Dr. E. Chambers, as specified in his will. This obituary, published in the West Briton and Cornwall Advertiser, contained several notable details. The reference to 3 children having preceded him in death is particularly significant, as the Harrisons had been living in Cornwall as a childless couple. This suggests that in his final arrangements, James Harrison chose to acknowledge the children he and Eleanor had lost in America, perhaps feeling that concealment was no longer necessary as he faced his own death. Even more striking is the revelation that Harrison had named Edward Chambers, the very photographer whose work seemed connected to his family's tragic fate, as the beneficiary of his estate. After years of apparent estrangement and Harrison's dramatic flight from America, this posthumous connection between the 2 men raised profound questions about their relationship and Harrison's understanding of the events that had destroyed his family. The reference to Dr. E. Chambers, rather than simply Edward Chambers or E. Chambers, photographer, suggested that Chambers had indeed completed or resumed his medical training, a detail that would prove significant as we traced his own path after leaving Blackwood. Dr. E. Chambers, Edward Chambers, the photographer who took the fateful family portrait. Somehow, despite the apparent rift between them, Chambers and James Harrison maintained a connection significant enough that Harrison left him his estate. This connection between the 2 men, persisting despite the tragic events that linked them and their geographical separation, was perhaps the most mysterious aspect of the entire case. Harrison had confronted Chambers after his children's deaths, had threatened to expose him. According to Chambers' own notes, he had fled America, changed his name, and lived in self-imposed isolation. All actions suggesting a desire to escape from his past, and particularly from his association with Chambers and the photograph that Harrison had come to believe had marked his family for death. Yet in his final act, the disposition of his estate, Harrison had reached back across that gulf, naming Chambers as his beneficiary. Was this an act of reconciliation? Of recognition that Chambers, too, had been haunted by what had happened? Or was it something more complex? Perhaps an acknowledgement of a connection that neither man had sought, but that had bound them together through the inexplicable events surrounding the Harrison family portrait. Whatever the nature of this connection, the fact of its existence suggested that the story of the Harrisons and Edward Chambers extended beyond what was documented in Chambers' notebooks or evident in the infrared image of the skeletal figure. There was another chapter, one that played out privately between the 2 men over the years following the Harrisons' departure from Blackwood and their relocation to Cornwall. Meanwhile, our investigation into Edward Chambers revealed equally surprising developments. Chambers continued to operate his photography studio in Blackwood until 1915, the same year the Harrisons left town. Then, abruptly, he too departed. leaving the studio to an assistant. The timing of Chambers' departure, coinciding exactly with the Harrisons' own exit from Blackwood, immediately caught our attention. Was this merely coincidence, or had the two departures been coordinated in some way? Had Chambers fled because of growing suspicions about his connection to the Harrison family tragedies? Or had he perhaps followed the Harrisons, either to monitor them or to continue some interaction that had begun in Blackwood? According to town records, Chambers sold his photography studio to his assistant, Robert Pearson, for a nominal sum in April 1915. Pearson continued to operate the business as Pearson Photography, successor to Chambers' studio, until the early 1930s. Interviews with elderly residents who remembered Pearson described him as conventional and businesslike, focusing on standard portrait photography without the experimental approach that had characterized Chambers' work. Chambers' departure was apparently as abrupt as the Harrisons'. The local newspaper made no mention of a farewell gathering or public announcement of his plans. His landlord reported that the studio's living quarters were left meticulously clean but entirely empty, with no personal effects remaining. The basement laboratory, however, showed signs of hasty clearance, chemicals disposed of, specialized equipment removed, and, according to the building's maintenance man, a strong smell of burning, as if papers had been destroyed. He resurfaces in Boston medical records as Dr. Edward Chambers, suggesting he had either completed medical training previously or obtained credentials during this period. He worked briefly at a private medical practice specializing in radiographic diagnosis. Records from the Massachusetts Medical Society show that Edward Chambers was granted a medical license in September 1915 based on prior medical education and demonstrated expertise in radiographic techniques. This unusual path to licensure, without completing a conventional medical degree, was possible in that era, particularly for individuals with specialized technical knowledge in emerging fields like radiology, where formal training programs were still being developed. The practice where Chambers worked, Barrett Diagnostic Associates, was at the forefront of medical imaging in New England. Founded by Dr. William Barrett, who had studied with Röntgen in Germany, it offered X-ray diagnostics at a time when many hospitals were still acquiring their first radiography equipment. Barrett's practice catered to wealthy patients who could afford cutting-edge medical technology and physicians seeking consultations on difficult cases. Chambers' role at the practice was documented in their records as specialist in alternative imaging techniques, a vague designation that apparently covered both conventional radiography and whatever specialized methods Chambers had developed. Patient records from this period include several references to Chambers' method, or specialized photographic analysis by Dr. Chambers, though the specific nature of these procedures was not detailed. Medical journals from 1916-1917 contain several articles authored by Chambers on alternative visualization techniques for internal anomalies. Though the described methods are vague and the results anecdotal at best, the medical establishment appears to have largely dismissed his work. These articles, published in journals like the Medical Record and the Boston Medical and Surgical Journal, predecessor to the New England Journal of Medicine, outlined what Chambers called non-radiographic visualization of internal physiological states. He described a process involving specially treated photographic plates sensitive to emissions in the infrared spectrum that could allegedly detect disturbances in the body's energetic field preceding physical manifestation of disease. The reaction from the medical establishment was predominantly skeptical. A review in the Journal of the American Medical Association dismissed Chambers' work as reminiscent of the discredited theories of animal magnetism, lacking in scientific rigor and reliant on anecdotal evidence rather than controlled studies. Another reviewer noted the curious absence of specific methodological details that would allow for replication and verification, perhaps reflecting Chambers' reluctance to fully disclose his techniques after his experiences in Blackwood. Despite these criticisms, Chambers appeared to have had some supporters within the medical community. Dr. Barrett clearly valued his contributions enough to keep him employed, and a small network of physicians in Boston and New York reportedly referred patients to him for his specialized diagnostic approach. Whether these supporters saw genuine medical value in his techniques or were drawn to their more esoteric implications remains unclear. Then, in late 1917, we find Chambers also traveling to England, just months after the Harrisons. His destination is listed as London, but subsequent records show he too relocated to Cornwall, taking up residence in a small cottage not far from where the Harrisons settled. The passenger manifest of the SS Olympic, sailing from New York to Southampton in December 1917, listed Dr. Edward Chambers, 52, physician, among its passengers. Like the Harrisons, he was traveling during wartime, suggesting urgency or significant motivation. His stated destination was London Hospital Professional Consultation, though no records of such a consultation have been found in the hospital's archives. British medical registration records show that Chambers established credentials to practice in England in early 1918, listing a London address initially. By March of that year, however, he had registered a change of address to Cliff Cottage, St. Just Cornwall, located less than a mile from the Harrisons' Rose Cottage in the same small coastal parish. The coincidence of both Chambers and the Harrisons relocating to the same remote area of England after leaving Blackwood in the same year strained credulity. It suggested not just a continued connection between them, but an ongoing relationship significant enough to influence their choice of residence after leaving America. Whether this relationship was collaborative or adversarial, whether they sought proximity for mutual support or mutual monitoring, remained to be discovered. The coincidence seemed too great. Both the photographer who captured the mysterious image and the family it affected fled to the same remote corner of England within months of each other. Cornwall records show that Chambers established a small practice there, catering mainly to the local fishing community. He was known for his unusual diagnostic methods and his reluctance to refer patients to larger hospitals. Parish records and local business directories list Chambers as physician and medical photographer, suggesting he was combining conventional medicine with his specialized photographic techniques. His practice was based in his cottage, with a converted outbuilding serving as his consultation room and laboratory. Unlike in Blackwood, where his photography studio catered to the town's elite families, his Cornwall practice served primarily working-class patients, fishermen, miners, and agricultural workers from the surrounding area. Local accounts describe Chambers as a dedicated physician who often accepted payment in goods or services rather than money from patients who couldn't afford his fees. He was particularly noted for his success in diagnosing respiratory conditions common among miners and fishermen exposed to harsh conditions. One mining company's medical records credit him with early identification of developing lung disease, allowing for intervention before debilitating progression among its workers. Despite this apparent success, Chambers maintained a cautious approach to his specialized techniques. He kept no written records of these diagnoses, and patients reported that he would often attribute his insights to careful observation rather than any special methodology. Unlike in his Blackwood period, where he had documented his experiments extensively in his notebooks, in Cornwall, he seemed determined to leave no detailed record of his methods or findings. Most intriguingly, a local doctor's journal mentions Chambers' technique. Dr. Chambers employs a novel method of diagnosis involving specialized photography. While unorthodox, I have witnessed cases where he detected internal ailments weeks before conventional symptoms appeared. His reluctance to share his methodology with the wider medical community is regrettable. This observation comes from the diary of Dr. Richard Penrose, the local physician who would later attend both Eleanor and James Harrison in their final illnesses. Penrose, educated at Edinburgh and London, was initially skeptical of Chambers' methods, but apparently became convinced of their efficacy through direct observation. His diary records several cases where Chambers' diagnoses preceded visible symptoms by weeks or months, with subsequent developments confirming his predictions. Penrose's notes also contain tantalizing references to the connection between Chambers and the Harrisons. One entry, dated May 1919, reads, "Called to Rose Cottage for Mrs. Harris, Eleanor Harrison. Found Dr. Chambers already in attendance." Their manner suggested a history beyond professional acquaintance, though neither acknowledged it directly. The tension in the room was palpable, as if all three were actors in a drama whose script remained unspoken. Mrs. Harris exhibited extreme agitation at Chambers' presence, yet seemed unwilling to have him leave. Most curious. Another entry, from September 1921, offers further insight. "Mr. Harris, James Harrison, encountered me on the coastal path and inquired anxiously whether I believed in Chambers' diagnostic abilities. When I affirmed that I had seen remarkable results, he became agitated, declaring, 'Then you believe a photograph can see death coming?' Before I could respond to this strange question, he apologized for his outburst and hurried away. I cannot make sense of the incident. Chambers continued his practice until his death in 1924. According to his will, all his equipment, notes, and photographic plates were to be destroyed. However, a small collection of his papers somehow made their way back to Blackwood, the very papers we had discovered in the Historical Society. Chambers' will, filed with a solicitor in Penzance, contained unusually specific instructions regarding his professional materials. All photographic equipment, chemicals, treated plates, and technical notebooks are to be destroyed by fire immediately upon my death, the ashes scattered at sea. No examination or inventory of these materials is to be permitted under any circumstances. The document emphasized that this destruction was a matter of public safety rather than personal preference, though it did not elaborate on the nature of the danger. The executor of the will, Solicitor Thomas Curnow, later stated that he had carried out these instructions precisely as specified, supervising the burning of multiple crates of equipment and documentation from Chambers' cottage laboratory. He described the contents as including an unusual camera with multiple lenses and filters, several dozen glass plates stored in sealed containers, and approximately 10 leather-bound notebooks filled with technical notations and what appeared to be medical observations. Yet despite this apparently thorough destruction, the small collection of notebooks that we discovered in the Blackwood Historical Society somehow survived. According to the Society's acquisition records, they were donated in 1947 by A. Pearson of Boston, possibly a relative of Robert Pearson, Chambers' former assistant who had taken over his Blackwood studio. How these specific notebooks escaped the destruction ordered in Chambers' will remains unclear. They may have been materials that Chambers left behind in Blackwood, or perhaps they were deliberately preserved by someone who recognized their significance despite Chambers' wishes. What is clear is that these surviving notebooks represent only a fraction of Chambers' records, primarily from his earlier period in Blackwood, before the full development of his technique and before his growing fears about its implications. The more detailed documentation of his later work, including any records of his interactions with the Harrisons in Cornwall, was apparently successfully destroyed as he had directed. The connection between Chambers and the Harrisons in Cornwall suggests either continued experimentation or perhaps an attempt to undo what both parties may have come to believe was a curse. Their proximity in Cornwall, living less than a mile apart in a remote coastal village, can hardly have been coincidental. After the tragedies in Blackwood and their apparent rift, with James Harrison threatening to expose Chambers, why would they choose to live as neighbors unless they still had unfinished business with each other? One possibility is that Chambers was attempting to help the Harrisons, perhaps trying to develop a method to counteract whatever effect he feared his original photograph had created. His continued practice of medical photography in Cornwall, along with his apparent attendance on Eleanor Harrison during her illnesses, suggests he hadn't abandoned the techniques that he believed had contributed to the children's deaths. Alternatively, perhaps the Harrisons sought proximity to Chambers out of a belief that he might be able to protect them from whatever had claimed their children. If they had come to believe in the reality of the skeletal figure and its power to influence life and death, they might have seen Chambers, the man who could detect its presence, as their best hope of avoiding the same fate. A third, darker possibility is that Chambers was monitoring the Harrisons to document the continuing effects of his photographic intervention, treating them as ongoing subjects in an experiment that had moved beyond his control but remained of scientific interest to him. This would explain his presence at Eleanor's sickbed and James's apparent ambivalence toward him, seeking his insight while also resenting his involvement. But the most disturbing discovery came when we examined Chambers' death certificate. I was struck immediately by the date, October 12, 1924. This was precisely 15 years after the death of Thomas Harrison, the first child to die after being marked by the skeletal figure in the photograph. The coincidence of timing seemed too precise to be random, suggesting a pattern or cycle that extended beyond the immediate Harrison family. When I examined the cause of death listed on the certificate, signed by Dr. Richard Penrose, I felt a chill of recognition. Complications from pneumonia, the exact same diagnosis given to Thomas Harrison 15 years earlier. According to Penrose's notes, Chambers' illness had progressed with the same unusual rapidity that had characterized Thomas's decline, from apparent health to critical condition in just 3 days. Edward Chambers died on October 12, 1924. The cause of death was listed as complications from pneumonia, the same diagnosis given to young Thomas Harrison 15 years earlier. Dr. Penrose's case notes for Chambers' final illness describe symptoms identical to those he had recorded for Eleanor Harrison's death the following year. Severe respiratory distress, high fever, and a wasting effect that seemed to advance with unnatural speed as if months of illness were compressed into days. He noted that Chambers remained lucid until near the end, declining pain relief in favor of mental clarity, and spent his final hours making additions to his will and writing what Penrose described as a confession or final testament. The parish death register contains an unusual notation beside Chambers' entry. The register clerk, who normally recorded only the basic facts of name, date, and officiating minister, added a personal observation. Dr. Chambers' body bore no evidence of the wasting illness Dr. Penrose described. It appeared rather as if something had been extracted from within, leaving the shell intact but somehow hollow. In 20 years of preparing the dead for burial, I have never observed such a condition. Chambers was buried in St. Mary's Churchyard, the same cemetery where Eleanor and later James Harrison would be interred. His grave, marked by a simple granite headstone, bears only his name and dates, with no epitaph or religious inscription. Local tradition holds that wildflowers will not grow on the grave, though scientific investigation attributes this to the site's unusual soil acidity rather than any supernatural cause. But even more chilling was a codicil to his will, dated just days before his death. This codicil, filed with solicitor Thomas Curnow, but unsealed only after Chambers' death, contained instructions beyond the destruction of his equipment and papers. It included funds for the maintenance of his grave and specific directions that no photographic image of any kind is ever to be made of my gravestone or burial plot. It also contained a substantial bequest to the Harristons, listed under their Cornwall identities as James and Eleanor Harris, with the stipulation that the funds were in recognition of a debt that cannot be repaid but must be acknowledged. Most significant was the personal statement included in the codicil, what Dr. Penrose had described as a confession or final testament. This document, preserved in the solicitor's files and later donated to the Cornwall County Archives, provides the most direct insight into Chambers' final understanding of the events set in motion by the Harrison family photograph. I, Edward Chambers, being of sound mind though failing body, make this final addition to my testament. Let all my photographic equipment be destroyed, particularly the modified camera and the chemical compounds in the locked cabinet. The process I discovered was not meant for human knowledge. What it reveals, it also invites. I have seen my own image under the light, and I know what comes for me now. The hand that has touched so many through my lens now rests upon my own shoulder. James was right. We have opened a door that cannot be closed. This statement, with its references to what it reveals, it also invites, and the hand that has touched so many through my lens, aligned precisely with the fears Chambers had expressed in his Blackwood notebooks years earlier. The mention that James was right suggested ongoing discussions between the two men during their years in Cornwall, conversations about the nature of what had been set in motion and its inexorable progression. Most chilling was Chambers' claim to have seen my own image under the light, implying that he had used his specialized photographic technique on himself and detected the same skeletal presence that had appeared in the Harrison family portrait. If his pattern of observations held true, this would explain his certainty about his impending death and his careful preparations for it. The statement's conclusion, "We have opened a door that cannot be closed," suggested that Chambers had abandoned any hope of counteracting or controlling whatever force he believed his photography had contacted. After years of apparent experimentation and observation, his final conclusion was that the phenomenon was beyond human intervention. A door opened that would remain open regardless of his or the Harrisons' efforts to close it. After learning all this, I felt compelled to re-examine the original photograph using an even broader spectrum of analytical techniques. The initial infrared analysis had revealed the skeletal figure standing behind the Harrison family, its hand resting on young Thomas's shoulder. But Chambers' notes suggested that he had eventually detected similar presences associated with the other children as well, fainter, as if more distant, but unmistakable. I wondered if our modern equipment, with its greater sensitivity and range, might reveal what Chambers had observed in his subsequent examinations. My team developed a new scanning protocol that combined multiple wavelengths across the infrared spectrum, creating a composite image that revealed details invisible to any single frequency. We also employed advanced image processing algorithms to enhance subtle variations in density and contrast that might not be apparent to direct observation. Using a newly developed scanning method that combines multiple wavelengths, I discovered something we missed in our initial analysis. The new scan confirmed what Chambers had described in his notes. Behind William, the eldest Harrison child, there was indeed a second skeletal figure, less distinct than the one behind Thomas, with less detailed anatomical features, but unmistakably present. And behind Catherine, the faintest outline of a third figure, barely discernible even with our enhanced techniques, but conforming to the basic structure of a human skeleton. What stunned me was the positioning of these additional figures. They weren't randomly placed or simply standing near the children. Each was in a posture of interaction. The figure behind William with its hand extended toward the back of his neck. The figure behind Catherine with its arm reaching around as if to embrace her from behind. These weren't passive presences. They were engaged with their subjects in specific, deliberate ways. The additional figures weren't visible in our first infrared scan. They only appear when multiple specific wavelengths are combined, wavelengths that our modern equipment can generate simultaneously, but that Chambers would have had to capture in sequence. This technical detail is significant. It suggests that Chambers' original technique, which revealed only the most prominent skeletal figure, had limitations that he later overcame through refinement of his methods. His notes indicate that he re-examined the original plates after Thomas's death and discovered the additional figures, implying that he had developed more advanced analytical approaches in the intervening months. With our modern equipment, we can capture and combine multiple wavelengths simultaneously, creating a comprehensive visualization that would have required Chambers to conduct several sequential exposures or analyses. This efficiency allows us to see patterns and relationships that might have emerged for him only gradually, over repeated examinations with varying techniques. The positioning is consistent with Chambers' notes. The skeleton behind Thomas is the most defined. He died first. The one behind William is less clear but still distinct. He died 2 years later. The one behind Catherine is faintest. She was the last child to die. The correlation between the clarity of the skeletal figures and the timing of each child's death is striking. Thomas, with the most distinct figure and direct physical contact, died within months of the photograph. William, with a less defined figure making more distant contact, survived for approximately 2 more years. Catherine, with the faintest figure and least direct interaction, lived the longest of the 3 children. This pattern aligns perfectly with Chambers' growing belief that his photographic technique was not merely detecting impending death, but somehow influencing its timeline, that the clarity of the skeletal figure in the infrared image correlated with the imminence of death's arrival. Modern statistical analysis would describe this as a perfect positive correlation between image clarity and proximity to death, which is either a remarkable coincidence or evidence of a genuine connection between the photographic anomalies and subsequent events. And this partial figure entering the frame, I believe it represents what Chambers came to fear, that his photographic technique was not just revealing these entities but somehow attracting them. At the very edge of our enhanced scan, barely visible even with the most sensitive settings, is a 4th skeletal figure, this one only partially in frame, as if it were entering the scene rather than already positioned within it. Only the skull and one shoulder are visible, but the anatomical details match the precision of the other figures, particularly the one behind Thomas. This peripheral figure doesn't appear to be interacting with any of the family members directly. Instead, its position suggests movement toward the group as a whole, as if it had been drawn to the scene by the photographic process itself, rather than by any specific individual within the frame. This aligns with Chambers' later fear that his technique was summoning, rather than merely revealing, that the act of creating these specialized images somehow attracted or facilitated the presences they depicted. The partial figure at the edge of the frame represents, in essence, the visualization of this fear, evidence of something being drawn into the human world through the window Chambers had unintentionally opened with his experimental photography. Our investigation into the Harrison family photograph has taken us from a routine conservation project to a century-old tragedy that spans continents. Was Edward Chambers a misunderstood medical pioneer whose diagnostic technique was simply ahead of its time? Or did he, as his later writings suggest, discover something that crossed the boundary between science and the supernatural? The facts themselves are clear and documented. A family photograph taken in 1909 contains anomalies visible only under specific analytical conditions. The family in the photograph, parents and 3 children, experienced a series of tragedies following its creation, with all 3 children dying young and the parents living out their final years in isolation. The photographer who created the image abandoned his studio, followed the family to a remote location, and eventually died of an illness similar to that which claimed the first child. These events, spread across 15 years and 2 continents, are connected by documentary evidence, death certificates, travel records, personal correspondence, and professional papers. The correlation between the photographic anomalies and subsequent deaths is precise and consistent. The specialized knowledge and equipment required to create the original image and detect its hidden elements were available to Chambers through his unique combination of medical training and photographic expertise. But correlation is not causation, and the precise nature of the connection between the photograph and the tragedies that followed remains open to interpretation. Was Chambers correct in his growing belief that his technique had opened a door to something beyond normal perception, something that could influence life and death? Or was the photograph merely a remarkable example of early medical imaging, documenting physiological conditions that were already present but not yet symptomatic? We may never know for certain. The Harrison family is long gone. Chambers' full technique died with him. The equipment was destroyed as he requested. The deliberate destruction of Chambers' equipment and most of his papers, carried out according to his explicit instructions immediately following his death, has left us with only fragments of his methodology and thinking. The surviving notebooks from his earlier period in Blackwood provide insight into the development of his technique and his growing concerns about its implications, but they don't contain the complete details of his methods or his final conclusions about their nature and effects. The Harrison family left no journals or letters explaining their understanding of the events that destroyed their family. Their decision to change their name slightly and live in isolation suggests a desire to disconnect from their past, but their continued proximity to Chambers indicates a more complex relationship than simple flight or avoidance. The photograph itself, now preserved in the Smithsonian's conservation facility, remains the most tangible evidence of whatever phenomenon Chambers detected or created. Modern analysis confirms the presence of the anomalies he described, but cannot definitively establish their origin or nature. The image continues to exist in a liminal space between scientific evidence and inexplicable mystery. As a scientist, I'm reluctant to embrace supernatural explanations, but I cannot deny the precision of the skeletal images in this photograph, nor their correlation with subsequent deaths. At minimum, Chambers appears to have discovered some method of medical imaging that could detect serious illness before symptoms appeared. In 1909, decades before technologies like MRI or CT scans, the anatomical accuracy of the skeletal figures argues against dismissing them as random chemical artifacts or misinterpreted patterns. These are not vague shapes that the human tendency toward pareidolia has organized into meaningful forms. They are detailed, anatomically correct representations of human skeletons, positioned in deliberate relationships with the living subjects of the photograph. From a purely scientific perspective, it's conceivable that Chambers developed a technique sensitive to subtle physiological changes that precede visible symptoms, perhaps variations in body temperature, changes in the electrical properties of tissues, or alterations in the body's infrared emissions associated with developing pathologies. His background in both medicine and radiography, combined with his documented experiments in specialized photographic emulsions, could have led to a genuinely innovative diagnostic approach. If this interpretation is correct, Chambers deserves recognition as a pioneer in medical imaging, decades ahead of his time. The tragedy is that his technique, whatever its nature, was lost with his death rather than developed and refined into a potentially valuable diagnostic tool. What troubles me most is Chambers' fear that the technique itself somehow influenced outcomes, that by revealing death's approach, he was somehow facilitating it. That's beyond scientific explanation. And yet, this aspect of the case challenges my scientific worldview most directly. The idea that observation itself might influence outcomes does have some basis in quantum physics, the well-known observer effect, where the act of measurement affects the phenomenon being measured. But applying this concept to human mortality, suggesting that detecting death's approach might hasten its arrival, moves beyond established science into more philosophical or metaphysical territory. Yet I cannot simply dismiss Chambers' conclusions. He was a trained scientist and careful observer who documented a perfect correlation between his photographic technique and subsequent events. His growing conviction that his method was not merely diagnostic but somehow causative evolved through direct observation of multiple cases over several years, and his final act, destroying his equipment and records to prevent further use of the technique, suggests a level of certainty about its dangers that came from something more substantial than superstition or guilt. I find myself in an uncomfortable position as a scientist, unable to fully explain the evidence before me through established principles, yet equally unable to dismiss it as coincidence or misinterpretation. Perhaps Chambers discovered something at the boundary of science and other ways of understanding reality, a technique that worked through mechanisms we still don't comprehend, with implications he grew to fear with good reason. The Harrison family photograph remains a disturbing anomaly, a window into either a forgotten scientific breakthrough or something far more mysterious. It reminds us that photography, from its earliest days, has been seen as a technology that straddles worlds, capturing not just what is visible, but sometimes, perhaps, what lies beyond normal perception. Since its invention in the 19th century, photography has been associated with both scientific documentation and supernatural possibility. Early photographers were often viewed with suspicion, their ability to capture a perfect image of reality seeming almost magical in an era before such technology was commonplace. Spirit photography emerged alongside more conventional applications, with practitioners claiming to capture images of ghosts, auras, and other phenomena invisible to the naked eye. Chambers' work exists at the intersection of these traditions, combining rigorous scientific methodology with results that seem to extend beyond the boundaries of conventional science. His technique, developed through systematic experimentation and grounded in his medical and radiographic knowledge, nevertheless produced images that he ultimately came to interpret through a more metaphysical framework. The Harrison family photograph, with its hidden skeletal figures revealed only under specific conditions, embodies this duality. It is simultaneously a technical achievement, a specialized form of photography that revealed something not visible to normal perception, and a disturbing artifact that seems to have presaged or perhaps influenced a series of tragic deaths. Whether we interpret it as evidence of a lost scientific innovation or a glimpse into supernatural realities depends largely on our own framework for understanding the world. But either interpretation must grapple with the documented facts, the precision of the skeletal images, their correlation with subsequent events, and the response of those most directly involved, both Chambers and the Harrisons, who ultimately seemed to accept that the photograph had revealed something real and significant, something with power over life and death. What do you see when you look at old photographs? Mere fragments of the past, captured in silver and light, or something deeper? Moments where the veil between worlds grew thin, where the seen and unseen briefly converged. Every photograph is, in a sense, an act of preservation, an attempt to capture a moment that would otherwise be lost to time's passage. We preserve images of loved ones as a way of maintaining connection with them, of denying the finality of separation and loss. In this light, photography itself can be seen as a technology designed to challenge death's absoluteness, to allow the dead to remain present in some form among the living. But the Harrison family photograph suggests a darker possibility, that this preservation comes at a cost, that the camera's unblinking eye might sometimes capture more than we intend or understand. In seeking to preserve a moment of family unity and vitality, the Harrisons inadvertently documented something else entirely, what Chambers came to believe was death's approach, made visible through his specialized technique. Most family photographs in our albums show only what was visible to those present when they were taken. Smiling faces, special occasions, ordinary moments deemed worthy of remembrance. But Chambers' technique raises an unsettling question. What else might be present in these images, invisible to conventional viewing but potentially detectable through different methods of observation? What stands just outside the frame or behind the subjects, hidden from normal perception but possibly captured nonetheless? Next time you look at an old family portrait, remember the Harrison family photograph and its hidden occupant. And perhaps ask yourself, if we could see beyond the visible spectrum, what else might be standing there, just out of sight, its hand resting upon a shoulder? I'm Richard Blackwood, and this has been Shadow Frames. Until next time. Look carefully at what your photographs reveal, and perhaps more carefully at what they don't. Before we conclude tonight's investigation, I want to share with you one final, disturbing development. 2 weeks after Dr. Morgan completed her analysis of the Harrison family photograph, she contacted me with an urgent request to meet. When I arrived at her laboratory at the Smithsonian, I found her visibly shaken, something I hadn't witnessed during our entire investigation, despite the troubling nature of our discoveries. Dr. Morgan explained that she had decided to perform one additional scan on the photograph, using a new experimental technique that combined ultraviolet, infrared, and magnetic resonance imaging. This method, still in its developmental stages, was designed to detect physical and chemical changes in historical artifacts that might not be visible through conventional analysis. It was, in essence, an extension of the very techniques that Edward Chambers had pioneered over a century earlier. The results of this final scan, Dr. Morgan told me, had led her to seal the photograph in a specialized containment unit and to recommend its permanent restriction from public access or further analysis. When I asked what she had discovered, she hesitated before responding. "The entity in the photograph," she finally said, "appears to be aware that we're looking at it." Dr. Morgan showed me the results of her final scan, an image that differed subtly but significantly from all previous analyses. The skeletal figures were still present, still positioned behind the Harrison family members as before. But the primary figure, the one standing behind young Thomas with its hand on his shoulder, had shifted its posture slightly. Its skull, previously in profile, looking toward Thomas, was now turned toward the viewer, toward the camera, toward us. "This is impossible," Dr. Morgan told me, her scientific demeanor cracking slightly as she spoke. "The photograph is a fixed image created in 1909. There is no physical mechanism by which elements within it could reposition themselves in response to our observation. And yet, the implications of this final discovery are too disturbing to ignore. If the entity within the photograph is indeed responsive to present-day observation, if it is, in some sense, aware of being observed, then Chambers' fears about opening a door that cannot be closed take on new and troubling dimensions. Perhaps the door remains open. Perhaps our investigation, our attempt to understand what happened to the Harrison family, has attracted the attention of whatever presence Chambers' technique originally revealed. Dr. Morgan has requested reassignment to a different department at the Smithsonian. She has refused further contact with the Harrison photograph and has recommended its transfer to secure storage with strict protocols limiting future access. In a final email to me, she wrote simply, "Some things are not meant to be seen. Some doors are not meant to be opened. I fear we have looked too long and too deeply at something that is now looking back." As for me, I found myself studying the photographs on my own walls with new attention. The family portraits, the vacation snapshots, the casual images that document my life and the lives of those close to me. I find myself wondering what else might be present in these familiar scenes, invisible to normal perception, but perhaps there nonetheless. I find myself remembering Chambers' question, is it merely diagnostic, or does the process somehow summon the very thing it reveals? I have no answers, only questions, but I no longer take photographs casually, and sometimes in certain lights I catch myself checking the empty spaces behind my loved ones, searching for shapes that shouldn't be there, for hands resting on shoulders where no hands should be. This has been Shadow Frames. I'm Richard Blackwood. Good night, and watch carefully.